Welcome, Austin, Jim, and Al. Thought we're continuing our talk here today about the history of SPI and Jim's involvement in wargaming. One of the things that I'd like to ask you, Jim, is what did you think your best design was?
Best single design?
Yeah, single design or design that carried over between games.
Carrying over between games. Well, we had the France 40 system, which was, I think, first used for, I think the Battle of Kursk, which was suggested by Sterling Hart. He might have designed it. I'll see if I got that down here in my list of my designs.
Sterling designed
Kursk. Yeah, Sterling. And I said, use the France 40 system, and that was a operational level divisions, type game system, and it worked pretty well. And we used it for 3 or 4 at least, different games. Destruction of Army Group Center. I think maybe the Drive on Moscow. In other words, most World War II division level games or situations fit with that system. Now, the other system that works in many games was the tactical systems we used with the quadra games. These were the small games, simple games. And as I remember, we had a somewhat basic system, and there were major variations for each historical period. And so, most World War II and going into post World War II, we did at least one Sinai 73 war related game. I think that was the Battle of the Chinese Farm, and that was all amenable. And what we did was, to make it easier on the developers and the designers, was we eventually developed a rules master. I forget what year we actually did that. But eventually we had it when we started using the mid PCs, first PCs in the late 70s. We had that on a floppy disk, and you had master rules, whatever, and there was at least 2 or 3 versions. And the designer could just load a copy of that and start making modifications for his particular game. So yes, there was a lot of a system, as it were, or pattern analysis, as I later called it, of the similarities in many battles, and how you could basically use the framework for 80-90% of your rules. It would save you a lot of rules writing, and of course you knew if you were using the master, that was gone over with a fine-tooth comb, especially by the art department, which handled editing of final copy. And so you saved a lot of work for the art department. What the hell was the guy's name we had there? We got him from a scientific publisher. He was very good, but he appreciated that. In fact, he might have been behind it for all I know. Damn it, I wish you might find those details in the old copies of Outgoing Mail. Each issue of S&T had basically a chatty, update on how we were doing, what we were planning on doing, et cetera, but also included little details like how we were developing rules. And this was done not just for our customers, but also for our competitors. We basically spawned a lot of competition deliberately, and a lot of the guys from the other firms would come by on visits. Game Designers Workshop, I believe. Yeah, they came by. I even have pictures to prove it. There was about half a dozen of them wandered in. And we also had the military, the Army, the Marines, and I don't think the Navy or the Air Force ever showed up. But they basically came loaded for bear, as it were. They were not just looking for insights, but we told them, we will give you goodies, games to carry away with you that are appropriate to what your needs are, and that evolved into a chapter, a much expanded chapter in later editions of the War Games Handbook, which came out in, I think, 1980. So yes, we did have a lot of that, recognizing patterns and using them to make the work easier. Now, that I think still applies. I think you'll still see a lot of that in many of the manual game publishers that are still publishing. There's still a lot of these games being published because it's a lot cheaper to do the artwork. You do it online, as it were, not online, but with Adobe or whatever. And that has become a whole different history after I left. But it has kept the hobby alive because these publishers are often not, full time. Very few of them are, I don't believe. But they can afford to create and publish a game and break even, selling about 500 or so copies. And after that, they're making a profit. So a lot of the concepts we encountered early on and basically codified, we passed on, and a lot of them are still alive and well out there in the game design world.
So one of the things that you guys did was you did a lot of contemporary games, things that hadn't happened yet but could possibly happen in the near future. How did you go about researching that?
Well, there's a story oft repeated in print in me verbally, is that we attracted a lot of customers. In fact, we based upon our feedback results, we estimated about 20% of our customers were government. In other words, military, State Department, CIA, etc. And so I think this is in 1972. When did that game come out? Not Combat Command. Red Star, White Star, 1972. Yeah. So it must have been in early 72 or 71. We got I don't know if it was a letter, probably it was a letter from the infantry school, where a bunch of the instructors down there said, why don't you we're big fans of your games, et cetera, especially Panzer Blitz, and which we passed on to Avalon Hill. Why don't you do one on a contemporary subject? So I said, yeah, we could do that, but I need the following manuals. And I knew this because when I was in the service with an artillery battalion, spent a year over in Korea. That's a story unto itself. But anyway, when we were shipping over, they were basically throwing out a lot of field manuals, and a lot of them, I asked the first sergeant, I says, could I grab these? You can say, yeah, sure. They were all unclassified, but they were like the field officers this, the field officers that, logistics and what have you. These were a gold mine. And so I was somewhat aware of the manuals, and of course these guys were. And within a week there was a large crate delivered, not a crate, but a large box full of these manuals that they felt that I mentioned or they felt would be appropriate, and that got us started. And we did Red Star, White Star. Now, Red Star, White Star surprised everybody. It surprised us because it became an instant bestseller. We didn't know. I mean, that's one reason we did it. In fact, we probably ran the proposal and the feedback, and it probably scored very high. But we hadn't even thought of doing that because we were historical gamers. But when the idea was first proposed by the infantry school fellows, I said, well, yeah, that makes sense. Why not? And just about every contemporary game after that became basically our bestsellers. Our bestsellers were contemporary and future, not too future, but contemporary and future enough so that we could use recent battles. Now, this includes not just World War II, but also Korea, not so much Vietnam, although unless you wanted something on irregular warfare. And, of course, the Arab-Israeli wars, which we did games on as historical games. And it wasn't that difficult because, as I summarized and pointed out later, as long as you don't project too far into the future, you're safe. Now, some cases we had to. I mean, Red Star, White Star introduced the TOW, which is still used, the anti-tank guided missile, the wire-guided anti-tank guided missile, and they were somewhat surprised at that because that was a new thing, and they were just figuring out who to give it to, how to use it, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we did some work for them. Basically, we took the current doctrine, as it were, how many were available and how they were used, and we threw them in there, and we made a best estimate of what they could do. Now, a lot of information about how effective TOW was in combat came during the 1973 war, the Arab-Israeli war. But before that, we only had what had been published in the trade journals, which was often pretty good. There was a periodical which is still published called Aviation Week. And back during the Cold War days, intelligence people used to call it Aviation Leak, because we later confirmed what everybody suspected, that the Russians were grabbing copies of and sometimes sneaking them out in diplomatic pouch. It's just sort of for whatever reason, and they discovered a lot of stuff that they would have otherwise spent a lot of time, effort, and money on trying to steal from the source. But that was the way it was done in the West, and that's one reason why we had the technological advantage. But the later on, I was told they were using Red Star, White Star in the Pentagon, for planning. And one guy told me, he says, we had some classified data on a new version of TOW, and we basically had to create, in effect, a classified version of Red Star, White Star, which had this minor update, which didn't amount to a hell of a lot, but they had these security rules which they had to follow. But it just goes to show that you don't have to make many adjustments to do an effective and realistic contemporary game. And this is still being done. I mean, this came out, for example, during the 1991 war. By then, by the late 80s, early 90s, there were a lot of officers who had, like these young officers, instructors down at the infantry school, had risen up through the ranks. And the guys who caught on to it, like the guys I was talking to, were probably generals by the time the Gulf War came along, and they appreciated war games. They would tell the war stories, as it were, about Red Star, White Star, and so on and so forth, and how effective it was. So at that point, it was actually being used, and sometimes it got mentioned in the media stories. The guy says, we war game this, a dozen times and blah, blah, blah. And so we weren't too, we weren't too surprised that it worked. And it carried, even in the 2003, the invasion of Iraq, I think there was one story where the guy said, yeah, there was this one area we had to pass through, and the last dozen times I tried it, I was in the war game, and I kept getting killed. But this time, I guess I must have learned something, because we won, we survived, and we got through it. And that just shows you how should I put it, the unrecognized impact of war games when they present officers with a difficult tactical situation. And even though they're willing to try anything, because if they're dead, they're not really dead. Their idea is dead. So try something different. And so when this guy encountered this ambush situation at a bridge, I forget what town it was, he instinctively, deployed his forces in such a way that it would get around all the mistakes he had made earlier in the simulation that didn't work. And bingo, he blasted his way right through. A lot of officers even mentioned that their previous wargaming of situations like this, encouraged by the success of it in the 1991 100-hour war to chase the Iraqis out of Kuwait, continued to pay dividends, and it still does. For example, one of the things I think we mentioned in the strategy page during the height of the fighting in Iraq was how they developed a small little booklet for convoy commanders, and giving them a checklist. And this is an offshoot of war games, basically, it gives you all the things you got to check for and watch for that will avoid your guys getting caught and getting killed. And it was very successful. And you didn't have to be a war gamer to use it. It simply says you got this, you got that. The old checklist thing in the medical profession that rediscovered checklists, which aviation has been using for decades. I forget when, 70s or 80s and whatever, because a lot of the mistakes being made during surgery was because, we got this, we got that, blah, 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 blah. And they found that somebody came up with the idea, well, just use a checklist like they do before they take off on an airplane. I mean, we're operating on somebody. Let's do it. And I recently had some eye surgery, which I put off for a long time, and I was under, semi-sedated, and I could hear the doctor and the nurses going through the checklist before they actually started. So it's alive and well, and the operation's a great success. I don't wear glasses anymore. These are ideas that basically come from dealing with reality in a situation where you can change the approach. You can try something, potentially fatal, not just surgery, but a military situation or any kind of situation. That's where these what we call them conflict simulations, actually trying to be accurate, not just trying to be PC, because they can be applied to anything. And there's a lot of, businesses use marketing games, management games, and what have you. And we actually discussed this, or I discussed it in Outgoing Mail. I jokingly referred to the SBI game, which I used to manage. I really didn't, although probably I did unconsciously. Of all the people we had working there, I called it herding cats because they were all very creative, independent-minded. We encouraged that, but at some case, it could get out of control, and you had to know how to rein it in without squashing, the person who's trying to do their best. So these are ideas and concepts which we pioneered applying on a large scale. While I was at SBI, I think we published like 500 games. About 20% of them I designed myself. And towards the end, I was only the designer of last resort. In fact, one of my favorite games was where is it? I got the list in front of me. The year 1975, I think it was. The Battle for Germany. Where the hell is it? It's a long list. 75, 77, Invasion of America. God, good Lord, we were publishing. I was designing a lot of games. Anyway, Battle for Germany was done because the guy who was designing the game for the next issue of S&T had run into basically terminal problems, and we couldn't proceed with his particular game. I forget what the game was. I forget who the designer was. So I said, look, I had an idea cooking, rolling around in my head, which I haven't really followed up on. Give me overnight, and I'll see if I can do it. And it was a challenge. Can I do a game from like 6 p.m. to 6 a.m.? And I did. I even typed up the first draft of the rules. We had a setup back in the art department where you could put a map on the light table and put a blank hex sheet over it, and you could basically do a quick, dirty map. And that was an example. I mentioned that in Outgoing Mail, and just to make clear to people that it's important. If you are familiar with the games, and if you've designed a few, and you have an idea, it pays just to go in there and boom, get a first prototype out there as soon as possible. 1975 Battle for Germany, and the 12-hour game. And it's not something you can do, as just to show off, but it goes to show you what you can do if you're up against the wall, as it were, and you have no choice. As the old saying goes, heroes are cowards that got cornered. Working under pressure. But I was fairly confident I could do it, because a lot of the designs I came with were done like in a day, or a couple of days. I'd walk around, people say, well, why are you always out going through these long walks smoking cigars? And I said, well, it helps me think. And it later became a fact, so to speak, that people are more creative when they're on their feet and walking around rather than sitting down. So, in fact, sometimes I would do a lot of the whole game standing up, because to do the prototype map, you had to be standing up over the light table. Or I told people you could just get a bright day, sunlight, and use the window for a light table, put a map up, and then have a hex sheet over it so it'll show through, and bingo, or you're off. So, these were all ideas that came from, basically common sense, which is what, what we found out was operations research developed during World War II, or before World War II by the British, operational research, they called it, which is simply using common sense applied to real life situations. And of course, you had a lot of real life and death situations in World War II. And the operations research led to a lot of innovations in aerial and naval anti-submarine warfare, which are game changing, so to speak. They made an enormous impact. And we simply applied these to, recreating history. And of course, we found out that, yes, you also had a window to recreate the future, up to a point. The further forward you went, the more likely you were to be wrong. But we never really made that mistake in any of our future games. They were basically done by using the historical examples we were basing it on as the test. And it worked. And we basically used it, right up to the end, and it's still being used widely throughout the simulation world in general. Games, the most popular war games now are computerized, and they tend to be first-person shooters. But even those designers realize that verisimilitude, realism, is very important. And a lot of times they will basically bring in military veterans, or in many cases, they got people from the special forces, SOCOM, who are willing to do it, because then they had permission to walk away. In fact, they would get a copy of the code, as it were, and with permission to develop a classified version, which obviously wouldn't be sold. So they had their own programmers and what have you. Or, as many of these games did, they had well, they first called it a level creator, but it was later a scenario creator, a scenario creation, utility. And these became very popular and almost standard. You really couldn't publish a game, many of the modern, action games, as they call them, without a scenario, generator, as it were, or editor. And these basically provide a lot of feedback to the publisher, showing them what they could have done, but they didn't, because, it took one of their customers to come up with it first. And we recognize that, and we encourage people to basically send us ideas for improvements even after a game is published. In fact, that led to a whole other magazine called Moves, which specialized in publishing articles either by staff or mostly by contributors, gamers, who had come up with a better idea. And a lot of these ideas were codified and made available as official, addendums to existing games. So, again, these are ideas which have apparently existed for thousands of years, but they'd never, like most knowledge, until it got codified and written down where it could be easily reused, which is the beautiful thing about Gutenberg and, mass literacy. We suddenly had, the crowdsourcing, as they call it now. And you can basically get a lot more done because there's this huge collection of existing knowledge which is accessible, and all you do is tweak. And that's what I said early on to people who said, well, how do I design a war game? I says, well, first you become proficient in playing them. It helps if you're enthusiastic. This was only, we calculated only a few percent of the population had the the old Venn diagram, were historically curious, history fans, as it were, the people who buy all those books. But if you, in addition, had a sense of, I termed it as, you're not afraid of math and probability. You didn't have to be a math genius, but my God, we had a lot of guys showing up for the play testing who were math majors, or science majors, as it were, and including a lot of lawyers. I guess that counts. And they were a small segment of the population, maybe 2, 3, 4%. And plus, when you add in the computerized games, which made them more accessible, it probably goes up to 5, maybe even 10%. It's hard to say these days. But they were the audience for this sort of thing because they felt it was useful. They were comfortable with it. They enjoyed it. It was basically a way to solve mysteries, as one guy put it. In fact, we had focus groups where we bring in a random number of local gamers from our list. We, offer them a free game and a free lunch, as it were, if they come into our focus group. And I'll never forget this one guy. He was a doctor. And I asked him, well, how do you have time to play games? He says, well, I don't really like your surveys show. But when I get a new game, I just look at it. He said it's a different way of looking at information. It's much more accessible if you're analyzing. And I felt a kinship with this guy because I did the same thing. I was never a big fan of playing the games. I enjoyed developing the concepts and designing them. Then I have to test them, initially anyway, just to see if the thing works at all. And that was, it turned out to be, according to our regular surveys, every issue, one of the major attractions of the games, and it probably still is. And I told people in the military, this caught on in the late 70s, I think it was. It became a big deal in the military circles about, using this type of gaming. And I said before an audience of the assembled, military, gaming community or war game development community, the Beltway Bandits, as it were, but also some military people doing it. I says, ultimately, you want a game that commanders can play in private. It's a cultural thing, worse in some cultures than in others, but you don't really want to make your mistakes in front of a audience of your peers. Now that changed over the years as more war gamers rose up in the ranks and said, hey, there's nothing wrong with screwing up on a war game. It's going to save your butt, in the real thing, which later proved to be the case. So it's now taken as dogma. Yeah, you can do that. But back in the old days, I said, ideally, you want a game that a general officer, a higher ranking officer can sit down at home on a computer, easy to play, and, make his mistakes, but also develop plans that work. And actually, we did this during outside of the wargaming industry during the mid '80s. I was out by then, but I got roped in for projects, and one of them was Ray Macedonia, the guy who was put in charge of resurrecting military wargaming at the Army War College. He gave me an unexpected phone call in mid '70s and said, "Hey, I'm Ray Macedonia." Blah, blah, blah. And he explained what he wanted to do, and I said, "Yeah, I'll come down." And I started making regular visits down there, but it worked, and he understood that if people can play them and learn from these near future situations, they will not only refine the situation, but they will also gather insights. So when he called me when he retired, he was working for, I forget what the Beltway Bandit, not the manufacturer was up in New England. But anyway, they were developing these SAT-ARM. These were
AVCO, wasn't it?
AVCO, right. They're now part of something else. But anyway, SAT-ARM was a late Cold War weapon, which was an artillery shell with two of these SAT-ARM submunitions. Now, these things were released and fired. It was like time on target, as it were. You set the fuse so it would activate, as it were, when it was at a certain position. And these two SAT-ARM rounds, as it were, munitions, would separate, and they would I think they basically slowed their ascent by having some sort of spinning thing, in the rear. They didn't use a parachute. But anyway, they'd gotten all those details, sorted. And but what they weren't certain of was what the Russians would do. So they basically called in a guy using I forget what it was, but it was the equivalent of a early model. How should I put it? A 2086. Anyway, the 486. Yeah, the 486, the PC Plus, whatever it was called back in those days, the mid 80s. It was a powerful machine, but he was using was it Lisp? Anyway, one of the languages that had been created for creating simulations for the scientific community. So I sat next to him. I wrote him up an outline. This was a tactical game, and we had to include things like how the Russian doctrine, as tactical doctrine, if they encountered these things, how they would react, what they would do. I don't know if they actually ran the field test I asked. I think they might have. In other words, when these things land, they will one version of them was not just attacking as they were coming down. The sensor would look for armored vehicles and then attack from the top with this thin armor, and they were pretty effective. They tested that, but they also had a version that would basically land and just sit there waiting. They'd have a seismic sensor. When it landed, the seismic sensor would poke into the ground, and it could sense the rumble, as it were, of heavy vehicles approaching. Dead giveaway that there's tanks or whatever coming your way. And it would basically pop up, instead of, being dropped from an artillery shell, it would pop up and then come down, and it would do the search, use those sensors, and look for a target. So we set up the simulation, and we found out that it worked. I mean, the Russians would at the very least be slowed down. The best they could do was send troops out there to literally beat the bushes looking for these things. And I think to make that more difficult, they added a couple of explosive devices, little mines, as it were, that popped out with it. That if they got too close, if they tried to lay hands on it or whatever, it would blow up in their faces. So even the Russians have to recognize the futility of doing that. And so basically they had to find them, back away, open fire with their AK-47s and destroy it or damage it to the point where it wouldn't work anymore. And they keep looking for more. But the thing, and this met the criteria for the system. It was meant to slow down a Russian advance. This is exactly what they did, because we're popping these things in, with artillery, the landing version of Sidearm. And later we found out we could do it with rockets, the MLRS that was coming out about that time, or drop them from the air. And this basically cinched the deal, as it were. He said, yeah, this would be effective. Fortunately, or unfortunately, for AFCO, the Cold War ended a few years after this thing became available. And I think it was resurrected later on, but the technology had passed it by. I mean, it was a great idea. It worked, but it got halted because peace broke out in 91. And by the end of the 90s, the threat of war had returned. And I think some of them were used in the Gulf War. But basically we were the ones that were advancing, not the Iraqis. And so we never had to face an overwhelming attacking force, which had to be slowed down. And so that itself rendered, the sidearm, much less useful. But again, these are the ideas that with games or simulations, or serious games, they call them now, these non-military simulations, are still applicable. And again, using the rules that we basically codified. So that's why SPI always gets so much credit, because we had so many firsts to our credit. And they say, well, where'd that come from? I say, oh, SPI did it in such and such. When you do 500 games in, about 11, 12 years, you're going to be laying a lot of IP, intellectual property out there, new ideas. A lot of it's recycled stuff, like Dan was asking about with game systems where you recycle. But even with each recycling of the World War II operational level, the France 1940 system, there were minor changes. Like Austin was mentioning before we went on the air, I included a rule in one of my Bulge games where if you had an artillery unit close enough to a crossing, either a ford or a still intact bridge or a temporary bridge the Germans had put up, if you could keep firing air, time on target shells that would explode in the air, they would basically interdict or stop or block that route for the Germans, because while it wouldn't stop the tanks, it would stop all the fuel vehicles, supply vehicles, a lot of the troop transports, which were just trucks. And it worked. And we knew it worked because we'd used it before. And we used it as early as Normandy and probably in North Africa even. We passed the technology on to the British. So this was another example of an idea which has to be incorporated into a historical game to make it work. And finding out little details like that was not difficult, because when you look to simulate a battle or a situation, you have to go through and look at, well, what are the key factors? For example, when we were doing North Africa, operation level games, we said, well, why are the British always slower off the mark than the Germans? And we found out it was basically, training and tactics. And we basically had to include a rule for the British, the random leadership failure rule, which was basically the problem the British had. The Germans never hesitated. Their doctrine said, when in doubt, do something. And this always put their opponent off balance. All the other, the Russians and the British and even the Americans to a large extent, would hesitate if they ran into something. The Germans would not. And while this seemed like a costly and even suicidal approach, it wasn't, because they were using it against opponents that they knew would, at the very least, not be prepared to deal with this sudden attack. Although late in the war, it was understood that if you grabbed the position or you had the initiative, expect a German counterattack. And this somewhat diminished the effectiveness of it, but it also slowed us down, because after you did something that had a success, you basically had to limit it to face the inevitable counterattack. This is when sometimes it cost us big time. The invasion, the Anzio landing, which was meant to get around the Germans to capture Rome early by landing behind their lines. Initially, it was successful. The general commanding, who was later relieved, found out that they were moving too fast. He thought they were moving too fast, against the meager Italian or German opposition. And he said, they're going to counterattack, they're going to catch us and what have you. And of course, the correct answer was, well, wait until that happens. You got overwhelming force coming across the beach. You know what the Germans have in the area, or what in the region, as it were. You know how long it's going to take them to get into reinforcements. You have air superiority. Even with fog and what have you, you can get down there and you can get a better sense of what's on the ground than the Germans can. But the Germans were simply responding. And by the time the Germans did counterattack, they had too many troops, and it was no longer possible to us to make the advance we should have made. So there's an example of how it can basically, work against you. But again, there's an idea. There's an example of how you have to basically dig in to the history. And this is, and you need serious history. Popular histories don't often cover this. That's why the Army Green Books, the official histories of World War II, they were coming out in the 60s and 70s finally. And they were a gold mine, because they were basically the gold standard, as it were, for what actually happened, because it was written usually by combat officers or with the cooperation of combat officers who basically could answer the questions from the researchers or the writers as to, well, what actually did this, what actually did that. And again, we passed that information on to our audience, as it were, and to the people. Told the military, I says, you've got a gold mine here. You're creating all the tools you need. You just didn't know how to put them together. Well, they learned very quickly. I mean, I was a bit harsh initially. I said, look, you dummies can do this yourself. And they looked at me aghast. And I says, no, you can. And it didn't take them long to pick up on that. And I realized it would take a long time, because there was a lot of initial resistance to this, your toys. You're going to play with games. But like by 1990, 1991, the people in charge had basically experienced it when they were younger, and it was no longer, just toys. It was an essential tool in winning and winning big. In fact, the term they used after the Vietnam War when they started their reforms was to fight the first battle and win, because previous to that, the American Army, like so many other countries, including Russia, were not prepared to basically realistically fight the first battle. And of course, the army that was better prepared to fight the first battle, like in World War I, where the Germans almost took Paris in 1914, and in World War II, where again France was defeated because the Germans had war gamed out. their initial moves and what the French or the British or whatever could do. And of course, in Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia, where the Russians basically shot themselves in the foot by basically getting clobbered by the Finns in 1940 and misinterpreting the results, or Stalin didn't like the results. He had analysts, they had war gamers, as it were, who pointed out to him, what the mistakes were being, what he had to do, and he didn't move fast enough. And that's speed is an essential factor, not just in fighting, but in thinking, coming up with solutions. And that lesson was driven home to a lot of commanders during World War II, but it didn't become institutionalized in the military. So one thing Ray Macedonia was trying to do, and he accomplished to a large degree at the War College and throughout the military, was to institutionalize, the prior experience. In fact, they established in, I think, the 80s, the Center for Army Lessons Learned, which initially, didn't use, the internet, which now it does. And it wasn't top secret, but basically you had to have clearance to get in there. But basically any spy with their salt, hacker with their salt could get in there. But it was nothing more than stuff you could learn from the history book. It was all the lessons learned. And I got that idea when I was researching, I think it was one of my early games with Apple on Hill. No, it was my own first Bulge game. And I was down at the World War II records branch, which closed up, in the mid-'60s or something like that. And they had all these World War II records. And they had a lot of British expert people who were acting as a protocol. Some Central Army Lessons Learned. They got calls from historians, people writing books or whatever. Anybody could call in, and anybody could visit. I got to visit. But they was literally going through the filing cabinets of documents. And one thing I found were bulletins, intelligence bulletins, distributed on a daily or weekly or as needed basis during the Battle for France and Germany in 1944, and they were probably earlier. I only had the ones from 44, basically warning commanders of tactics that Germans were using and things they had to do to avoid them. And these were apparently very life-saving, but not everybody made access them or paid attention to them. The classic example of this mistake was during the Korean War. MacArthur simply took it as a given that the Chinese would not intervene. And even when he had evidence to the contrary, he says, no, that's just an aberration. And boom, we lost a lot of guys, when the Chinese did hit, and they hit hard and drove us all the way, from central North Vietnam all the way back to what is now the demilitarized zone or further back. So these are lessons that are eternal. And if you see any modern contemporary military defeat or future military defeat, you'll find that a large element will be ignoring the past. As the old saying goes, it just doesn't repeat itself, but it paraphrases itself very well. Yeah. And this is what war games let you do.
So one of the systems that SPI did that was very popular was, and I don't know how to say the name, is it Prestags or Prestags?
Yeah, I'll tell you a lot about that, because he was one of the prime, him and Steve Patrick were the big fans of that, and I said, yeah, that's a great idea. Al, why don't you explain how that came about and turned out?
I can't even remember what the
pre-modern history. You're right. I forget what he said. Right. Anyway, I think it was pre-modern historical tactical games.
Yeah, basically Chariot, Spartan, Legion, Viking, and Yeoman.
Right. The pre-gunpowder games.
Pre-gunpowder games. Yeah. The games you mentioned were mostly remakes of earlier games.
Right.
Like Renaissance of Infantry.
Right.
And Centurion. Was it Centurion? I don't remember. Yeah.
Or Legion. Whatever.
But what we were trying to do was let's get one basic set of rules, that are useful for all of these periods. Let's face it. Guy walking along with a spear in 2000 BC is not going to be fighting much more differently than a guy walking around with a spear in the year 1100.
Right.
So if we can come up with a system that reflects the nature of tactics with a few extra rules from time to time. Like the Carthaginians are going to have to drag in elephants and whatnot. So the games ended up being remade this way, and if you look carefully, comparing the originals to the remakes, I think you'll find that that there are considerable differences, but there are also enormous similarities.
Yeah. In fact, I remember one of the questions that kept coming up that triggered this, and that was people saying, "Well, what if the Roman legion had to fight a Viking army, or was that what if a Zulu Impi army, one of the more disciplined African group is the colonials had to run against. What happened if they ran across a Greek phalanx?" And these sound silly, but basically they got to the heart of the matter. These are all similar, successful military systems using often similar weapons. And so what makes them different? What makes one superior to the other? And it turns out it depends. Because the Roman legion did encounter the phalanx. They did encounter the horse archer. The Persian horse archer, these guys were formidable. This is something most people don't even realize to this day. Before stirrups, and at the time of the Roman legion, or actually earlier than that, the Persians had developed a military system that had guys armored troops on horses. The horses were armored. These guys were wearing plate armor, not the chainmail and what have you. Mm-hmm. And their weapons, the Greeks later adopted this as their cataphracts, which were, basically 100%, ripoff, but they worked for the Greeks too. And their weapons were a recurved bow. This is the bow the Mongols used. It was less unwieldy to handle, and it was necessary for a horseman to accurately, effectively use it. And basically, it didn't take up as much space. It still took a lot of pull, but really, actually, not as much as a crossbow. It was the physics of the bow, and it allowed horse archers basically to develop what was later never seen until repeating rifles came along. Enormous firepower from a distance against Romans, hoplites, whatever. Anybody who didn't have these arrows were always a problem for armies that were based upon infantry, like the Romans. The Romans had a tactic, the testudo, where they form a square, as it were. Guys in front would put their shields down, the guys behind would put the shields up, and you'd have like this armored box of shields. But these were not proof against the high-powered, recurved bow arrows. Now, the Persians not only had this, but each of these warriors, these Persian knights, as it were, had their bow, but they also had a shield and a spear and a sword. And I think the Greeks later used darts, very deadly darts, as it were, as well. They carried. They were very well kitted out. One reason they needed a horse to schlep all this stuff around, but they proved pretty nigh invulnerable. It wasn't until the Mongols showed up, and I don't know if I guess they were still using it, but the Mongols, like the Arabs who overran Iran in the initial outburst of Islamic armies, they caught the Persians in the middle of one of the perennial civil wars. One reason the Persians were such formidable fighters was they got plenty of practice. When there was nobody else to fight, they'd fight each other. But this made them unstable. If they were in the midst of one of their civil wars, they were vulnerable to an organized attack, and that's what hit them, in the 6th century. But when the Romans tried it, one of the great what ifs of history is Caesar, when he was assassinated in the Senate. That was going to be his last meeting with the Senate. Well, not last as in terms of being stabbed to death, but he already issued orders to assemble 15 divisions in Syria. He was going to take on the Parthians, and we'll never know if that would have worked, because the Romans never were able to conquer or defeat decisively the Persians, and eventually the best they could do was establish a sort of a ceasefire, as it were. But Caesar was planning to do it, and he had talked about some of his tactics and some of the strategies that were going to nullify the advantages of the Persian armored warriors. And we'll never know if those would have worked because we don't know exactly the details. He only mentioned it in comments to others before he was killed. But a general of his caliber, he was very innovative, very practical, and that's why he got so far. But he was also very forgiving of his enemies, which, allowed a bunch of them to get together in the Senate and stab him to death. But that's one of the great what ifs. That's one reason why we did the press acts. I forget what the results were. If you pitted a Parthian army, a Persian army, against a Roman legion. I should remember that, but I don't. In fact, maybe we never addressed it because there were too many unknowns. Nobody had actually done it.
Right, but that's one of the great things about wargaming is the what if, and a lot of people play them because of the what if.
Dan, let me add something there that's actually kind of funny. I remember at one of the play tests that I went to, I forget which game. Yeah, it may have been Dallas, Jim, that I was there, when we were working on that. And one of the play testers was talking to another one about, and this is the way I remember it, wars at the end of time, where you would have pitted, Mamluks against Mongols, even though you could say that they actually came off. I think it was Ein Jalut. And Al, you and I talked about this, and you chuckled and said, "Oh, that's something we talked about when working on some of these games of swords and spear area warfare." I don't know if you remember that, but I remember chuckling about it. Wars at the end of time. Well, let me add one other thing too. I remembered what it was when I broke in and said it was Avco. It was Textron Systems Division. Yeah, but I think Avco Systems was actually a subsidiary that Ray Macedonia had evolved from Colonel Macedonia into Dr. Macedonia, which he already was, and was head of that. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what it was. You're right. He was chief scientist. And what we worked on was something called the Wide Area Mine. That was the name of it. It even got named Hornet, and they went into pre-production with it. And here's why I remember it. There was still a little clip that Textron had made of some of their tests of this munition that was on the web early 2000s, because I remember seeing it and looking at it. And this weapon had a seismic sensor and an acoustic sensor on it. And I did about 4, maybe 5 reserve tours at the War College working on war games for Colonel Macedonia. I was doing it as Lieutenant Captain Bay. I was made captain. Jim helped set that up. And actually, the roots of that system came back in an analysis that Ray wanted done of what was called the Lurzer, L-O with an umlaut, S-E-R. Loser was the joke. Alternative defense of West Germany using light infantry up front. It just wouldn't work unless you had, and what I suggested to Colonel Macedonia was walking, talking mines. Ray comes back and he hires Jim and drags me along on this. And here are the walking, talking mines. They don't walk, but they're robots. And the game that Jim came up with had Russian attack formations coming through these, ideas of mines, because Ray kept fiddling with them, and his engineers coming up with little twitches and twerks to improve it, and it was all done inside the game, inside the computer, before they actually built them and started testing them outside. That's the applicability of a kind of war game that can be tweaked. Anyway, I just
Jim, go ahead, Al.
The idea of pitting like the Roman legion against the Zulu Olympian and whatnot, in the course of designing, was it Frigate?
Yeah.
I think. No, it was Dreadnought. In the course of designing Dreadnought, I believe there was an HMS Victory counter created. Remember that?
Yeah, that was a pre-Dreadnought.
No, we had someone figured out what the victory would be like. Nelson's victory, Yeah. And of course, it turns out that it would have been very effective against a destroyer. On the other hand, it would have gotten one bite maybe at a battleship and then it would have been over.
Yeah. So, Jim, as we wrap up here, I have one last question for you today. Is there a game that you wish you had not designed, or that you'd rather not have seen publication?
No. All the games were basically experiments. Some of the games, and in fact, all 5 of the 6 games published in Strategy and Tactics, the bi-monthly game magazine every year, were strictly, according to the feedback results. We put game proposals out there, and the ones that scored the highest. And this was very effective, very accurate, as it were, in determining, the popularity and saleability of the games. But once a year, we have what they call Editor's Choice. And I got to choose whatever the hell I wanted. And 2 of them were particularly noted as unpopular, but they were actually quite successful. One was Scrimmage, a tactical football game, which with the technology we developed there was later used in all the computerized games. But doing it manually was a bit of a chore. But we got letters from very grateful coaches. They said, yeah, this is great. I use it, to basically test my different formations and different tactics, or whatever they call them in football. And the other one was the Plot to Assassinate Hitler, which was basically a military, political game. We did a number of those. Chicago in 1971. That was about the Chicago ruckus that led to the Chicago 7 trial. And when I was up at Columbia, we had the uprising, as it were, or the occupation of the shutdown of the school in 1968, I guess it was. And they asked me to do a game. I did a game called Up Against the Wall, Motherfucker, and it was very successful. I mean, not just for the playful title, which was my only requirement for doing the game. It was a freebie. But it was very accurate, and it impressed a lot of people at Columbia at the time, who at first thought it was a joke, but then they sat down and played it and said, hey, this is pretty true to the actual situation, even though it might seem ludicrous, which said something about the situation. No game idea was wasted. I don't think we ever did any game that you can call a complete waste of time. Some were more successful commercially than others. Some were more successful design-wise than others, but none were, totally without merit. We basically, again, the feedback, kept us honest. Even with the Editor's Choice, there were games done with what the users wanted in mind. Now, the Scrimmage was simply something, not enough guys were, sports fans, or if they weren't willing to do that much work just to do one, one, what do you call it, one play. In football. Plot to Assassinate Hitler. People joke about the Plot to Assassinate Hitler, but nobody really wanted to play a game around it. But, if you're planning on overthrowing a government, it has its virtues.
Yeah. I think Plot to Assassinate Hitler now, after the movie Valkyrie, would have a different reception. In fact, I think it would be great to do it as a solo game. And because you did it actually as a 2-player game, I believe. Yeah,
you're right. Like Wolfpack and Operation Olympic, they were games where one side its moves were pretty much preordained by doctrine or custom or whatever, and it enabled one basically to have a truly solitaire game. There were a number of situations that lent themselves to that, and we availed ourselves. Some were successful, some were not. But that's why I say nothing was wasted.
Okay, well, we'll leave it at that. We'll wrap up. Just as a teaser for the next time we do this in a month, we've had a long break from talking about the wargaming history for various reasons. But in a month from now, we're going to do an an episode on one of the games we haven't talked about, Empires of the Middle Ages, which was a very popular game.
Mhm.
And
yes.
and then we're going to talk about how that transitioned into a multiplayer game called the 100 Years' War. So that's what
Right.
we'll be talking about next time. Bye.
All right.
Okay, good.
Well then.
See
Bye-bye.
y'all.
Bye, guys.
Bye. All right.